This novel revolves around the life of a young werewolf named Raven Gallagher, whose world undergoes drastic changes as she navigates through love, loss, and an ancient prophecy. Set against the backdrop of Werewolf Academy, Raven's life takes unexpected turns when a war between paranormal races erupts, disrupting her senior year and leading to the shutdown of the academy. Forced to adapt to virtual classes amidst the chaos, she also grapples with the emotional toll of losing fellow students. Raven's personal life is equally tumultuous. Her relationship with Theo, a central figure in her life, is fraught with complications. They have a history intertwined with love and conflict, which reaches a pinnacle when Theo fakes his death to protect Raven from a dangerous foe, Cain. Unbeknownst to Raven, Theo's actions are influenced by visions predicting future events, including his collaboration with Headmaster Crane, who harbors a deep hatred for Cain, his own son, due to Cain's role in his mother's death. Amidst the turmoil, Raven discovers she is destined for a greater role, as the ancient werewolf princess Fallon, destined to become queen. This revelation comes with the bittersweet knowledge that she must leave behind her life as an ordinary teenager and embrace her royal heritage. Alongside this, Raven faces the challenge of marrying all 4 of her mates, a groundbreaking decision requiring significant persuasion from the paranormal high court. The narrative also delves into Raven's maternal instincts and the protection of her child, Austin, from threats like Cain, who attempts to harm the baby out of jealousy and ambition for power. Theo's timely return saves them, revealing a complex web of deceit and survival that had kept him away. Ultimately, the novel is a tale of self-discovery, sacrifice, and the enduring power of love. It explores themes of transformation, both literal and metaphorical, as Raven transitions from a carefree student to a queen, learning to reconcile her past identity with her newfound responsibilities. The story culminates in a poignant reunion with Theo and the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, filled with passion and the promise of a shared future. Through it all, the characters navigate the complexities of love, loyalty, and the lengths one will go to protect those they cherish. Chapter 1. As I sat on the white fur-covered stool in front of the vanity in my bedroom, I stared at myself in the mirror. My long golden blonde hair fell over my shoulders in loose curls. I wore the same purple smoky eyeshadow look I normally wore. My eyes were framed by black eyeliner, and my lashes were coated in multiple coats of mascara. On the outside, nothing about me had changed. I still looked the same as I always did, except I knew that I was different. I was changed. And it wasn't only just me who had changed. Everything had changed. Almost everything that had become so familiar to me had shifted. Under ordinary circumstances, I would have been getting ready to start my senior year at Werewolf Academy. I would have been driving my mates nuts, because I would have taken way too long to achieve the perfect back to school look. 2 years ago today I had been fighting with Theo. 1 year ago today we had been getting ready for school together. That thought made me feel numb inside. The thing was, that was all in the past. So much had changed since then, and there was nothing I could even do about it. Nothing about this year was ordinary, and it was about to get a whole lot weirder. Werewolf Academy had shut down for the semester, and possibly the year. All of our classes were being held virtually. Not taking classes on campus was weird in itself, but even worse than that, students were dying. Every few days I received news in my Werewolf Academy email inbox that another student's life had been lost. I wasn't sure how many familiar faces I would see when we did finally go back to Werewolf Academy. No one had any idea how long it would take before we could return. Headmaster Black would reevaluate the situation in December, but as of right now, things weren't looking so good. We were in the middle of a war, the war between the paranormal races. It had begun just days after the end of the year carnival at Werewolf Academy. The vision that Gloria and I had seen had been right. Iris and Milo Santorini had started the fires that were still going in Wolflandia, and the paranormal World War had begun a week later. The day after the fires began, my mates, my friends, and I had fled to Nocturne Island, the island that was going to be our home for the indefinite future. It was the island where I belonged, sort of. Don't get me wrong. The island was beautiful. I had explored every inch of it. The beach spanned for miles, and there was a village with cobblestone roads and cottages, along with the forest and farmland. But it just didn't feel like home. I wasn't sure if it ever really would. We had been on Nocturne Island for 5 months, but instead of feeling happy and content, it still made me feel nauseous most of the time. Not that my current predicament helped with the nausea, I thought to myself. But even though it didn't feel like home and the place made me sick, I still lived in the castle. Yes, the castle, because I was about to ascend the throne. It had taken some convincing on Gloria's behalf to persuade the werewolves who ran the museum that I was Princess Fallon. After a lot of convincing, they ran some DNA tests which had proved that it was true. Not that I had needed the proof myself. I'd had enough visions of my past life as Princess Fallon to know that it was true. But the DNA tests had confirmed it for all of us, myself included, once and for all. I had been born to be the next queen of the wolves. Given who I was, we all knew that there was a high risk of Nocturne Island getting attacked if anyone figured out where we were. And considering Milos was able to figure out my location at any given time, Gloria had known that we needed to do something to protect me. The most obvious solution had been hiding Nocturne Island, not just from Milos and Iris but from everyone. My life was at a much greater risk now that it was well known throughout the werewolf world that I was the long-lost princess. We had to worry about other werewolves wanting to harm me, as well as paranormal beings from other races. Being princess came with its drawbacks, to say the least. So, to keep me protected, Gloria had rounded up some of the most powerful witches in the world to put a veil over the island. The veil had completely hidden the island. No one could locate it by boat or by plane. Just made the island appear as though it was a part of the ocean that surrounded it. Even though my mates all seemed to think the plan was genius, the truth was that I didn't trust it. I was afraid that someone would be able to figure out a way to undo the spell and remove the veil, that Milos would find us. The fear kept me up late at night, and even when I was able to fall asleep, I often had nightmares about it, nightmares that sometimes woke me up screaming. Every night, one of my mates slept with me. I needed someone to be there to console me. Even though I was about to become a powerful queen, the truth was that I still felt like I was in constant need of their protection. I knew I needed to stop worrying about what the future held. With the veil, we were safe for now. Well, most of us were safe, that is. I still missed Theo every single day since Milos had killed him. From the moment the silver bullet had stopped his heart from beating, it felt like a part of me had died with him. But life had been moving at high speed so fast that I didn't feel like I had really had the chance to grieve his death. I'd had to put on my brave face and be strong, even though the truth was that I felt anything but strong. Most of the time I just wanted to lock myself away in my bedroom quarters and cry myself to sleep. I wanted to cry until I had been completely drained of tears. But no one wanted a weak queen, and that was exactly what I was about to become. I wasn't strong or brave or as cold-hearted as I needed to be by any means, but I needed to keep that detail to myself. I wasn't about to let anyone know the truth about how weak I was. So, even though I wanted to cry my eyes out just about every day, I didn't. Instead, I had been trying to master my poker face. Every day I put a brave face on, trying to make it through the day as I silently felt my heart breaking in ways that I couldn't even begin to explain. This was one of those days where more than ever I needed to put a brave face on. I felt Theo's absence even more than I normally did. "Raven, are you ready now?" Maddie asked from behind me then. I glanced over at her. She wore her long black hair in a fancy updo on top of her head with a few loose curls in the front, and she was donning the light pink, lacy bridesmaid dress she had picked out for herself to wear. The high-low style made her tan legs look even longer, and the off-the-shoulder sleeves made her look like she had fallen out of a book of fairy tales. She had done a much better job at choosing a dress for herself than I ever could have, especially in my current state of mind. Yeah. As ready as I would ever be anyway, I thought as I met my eyes in the mirror one more time. "You look absolutely gorgeous, honey," Vince said as he entered the room, wearing the pink tux Maddie had picked out for him to be my bridesman. It was a few shades darker than her dress. Vince had added a few bright pink highlights to his hair, which he wore spiky in the front to complement the dress. "Thanks," I replied, not fully believing it myself. I rose to my feet, eyeing myself in the floor-length mirror that hung from the wall. The dress was the whitest of white with silver sparkly sequins adorned at the bust. The dress hugged my curves in all of the right places before flowing out into a poofy princess style. It was a pretty wedding gown, but honestly, it wasn't what I would have picked out for myself. It just didn't feel like me at all. If anything, I just felt kind of uncomfortable in the dress Maddie had chosen for me. There wasn't anything wrong with it. It just felt like a dress that someone else should have been wearing. I had been too depressed about Theo's death to plan the wedding, so I had pretty much left everything up to Maddie. She had been excited, of course, to plan every single detail of a royal wedding. The truth was that the photos from today would go down in history. It was the first historical wedding that had taken place on Nocturne Island in hundreds of years. Even more than that, it was the first royal wedding the werewolf world had ever seen, because the last king and queen had been crowned before the curse had turned into werewolves. I was talking about my biological parents, the first queen and king of the wolves, who had given birth to the first werewolf to have ever been born. Naturally, that would be me. According to the legends, the king and queen had died from the virus that had wiped out the majority of the ancient werewolf population, or they had been killed by the vampires who had ambushed the castle. I didn't believe the second theory, of course, since legend had it that the vampires had completely drained me of my blood, when that obviously hadn't been the case. No matter how the king and queen had died, though, the castle had remained vacant for years. That was why it had taken some convincing for the museum owners to fully believe that I was, in fact, the rightful heiress to the throne. Gloria had to tell them about the vision she had been having. They had needed to understand that me being queen of the wolves was essential for us to have any shot in hell at winning the war that had already begun between the paranormal races. The museum owners had finally given up their ownership of the castle and agreed to reinstate the palace as the royal palace, to let me become queen. But there was an unwritten rule about becoming the next queen of the wolves, one that had been around since the ancient times, one that they hadn't been willing to change for me. I had to take a husband. The truth? I knew this should have been an exciting thing for me to experience. I had the chance to marry the man of my dreams in a fancy royal wedding that any girl would have dreamed about, but instead of looking forward to this day, I had actually been dreading it. I knew that this wasn't the right time for any of that. I wasn't ready to choose just one of my mates to marry. There was a part of me that wished I could marry all of them. Choosing which of my mates I wanted to marry, which of my mates I wanted to make king, was hard enough, but having to do it so soon after losing one of my 5 mates for good only made the decision even more complicated. I had a feeling that things would have been different if Theo was alive. I was pretty sure there was a good chance that it was him who I would have been getting ready to walk down the aisle to, that he was the one who I would have chosen to rule alongside me. I was pretty sure that he would have been my ideal king and my ideal husband, but that option had been torn away from me. Instead, I had chosen the mate who I believed would make the next best king. All 4 of my mates were incredibly strong and powerful. All 4 of them would have made excellent kings. And yet, my head had told me which one of them to marry. My head had told me that one of them would have made the best king. And so, that was who I had chosen to marry, not because I loved any of them less than I loved him, because that wasn't the case at all. I loved all of them, which made it harder in a way to do this. Not that it was going to change anything. It was all just a transaction in a way. Nothing would change between the rest of us. We would still go on as usual, but still, I wondered if the rest of them were going to feel insulted that I didn't choose them to marry to be my king. We should really get going, Maddie said, her voice slicing through my thoughts. We're going to be late. Fashionably late, Vince corrected. It's always good for the bride to make a grand entrance. Under ordinary circumstances, I totally would have completely agreed with him. I was all about being fashionably late most of the time. But this time? Well, this time I was ready to just get this over with. Let's get this show on the road, I said as I clipped my veil into my hair. Maddie and Vince headed for the door, and I glanced over my shoulder at my bedroom quarters. The Queen's bedroom quarters. I was about to give up everything. My life as a single, unmarried, ordinary teenager, well, as ordinary as it could possibly get for a werewolf teenager. That is. And even though I was going to keep the name Raven, I also sort of felt like I was about to give her up in a way, too. It was all about what Raven Gallagher represented to me. It obviously wasn't the name I had been born with, but it was a big part of me and who I was. It meant so much to me. Raven Gallagher symbolized my human life. It represented my parents, the ones who had raised me to believe that I was their own. It represented the life I'd had before I had met all 5 of my mates, before I had even known that I was a werewolf at all. It represented Theo. A voice whispered at the back of my mind. The first time I had ever met him, I hadn't known that I had ever been anyone but Raven Gallagher. Nor had he or the rest of the Darkin. We had uncovered over time that I was Princess Fallon. So, even though my name was going to stay once I became queen, I also couldn't help but feel like I was about to leave behind Raven Gallagher in a huge way. I was about to close that chapter of my life, the human chapter, for good. No, the name Raven would stay, but the truth was that I was about to embrace the ancient within me. I was about to give into my life as Fallon, the ancient werewolf princess I had been born as, was always destined to have. The ancient werewolf princess who was about to become queen. The queen who Theo would never know. I forced back the tears. I couldn't think of him right now. Right now I had to get ready to embark on this new journey. Couldn't take on my new roles as wife and queen with tears streaming down my cheeks. Everyone would be watching. Following my friends down the hallway, I could already hear the sound of cannon and D beginning to fill the air. As we reached the door that led into the castle's cathedral, Vince gave me a kiss on the cheek. Break a leg. Don't tell her that. You're completely jinxing her, Maddie hissed at him. Then, putting on her best smile with her glossy pink lips, she opened the door and began to walk down the aisle. Vince followed after her. I heard the crowd all rise to their feet. It was going to be so hard to face my other 3 mates. Even though I knew that they understood that I'd had to make a decision, I was pretty sure that none of them actually liked my decision. All 4 of them had wanted to marry me. All 4 of them had been ready and waiting to become my king. I wished that I could change it. More than anything, I wished that there were 4 of me, 1 for each of them. If only. Instead, I was going to marry him, and only him, while the others watched. I was thankful for the locket that I wore around my neck, the one that contained the herbal concoction that prevented my mates from being able to listen in on my thoughts. I wore it all the time lately, but I felt like I needed today more than ever. The last thing I wanted was for my mates to be able to hear my thoughts on my wedding day. My fiancé stood at the end of the aisle waiting for me, his eyes pouring into mine from across the room. Deep down, I knew that this marriage was all just part of a contract. It was a way for me to become queen. But that didn't stop my heart from feeling things. The way he looked at me, well, it was like I was the only one in the room. Was like we were the only ones in the room, like no one else was in the cathedral around us. It was almost as if my other mates weren't even there. Even though I was aware of their presence and that they were watching me, I also couldn't bring myself to look at them. I knew that I wouldn't be able to keep it together if any of them had a sad look in their eyes. As it was, I already felt a little guilty. There was also the fact that I couldn't bring myself to break my gaze with him, my king. I had almost approached him when I felt it. It was only the second time I had felt it. The first time it had been the faintest feeling in my stomach, almost like a flutter. This time it was sharper, harder. A moment later it was followed by the slightest bit of pain, and somehow I just knew what it was. It was the baby kicking. At that moment, I heard a clap of thunder and saw a flash of lightning which lit up the entire cathedral. I couldn't help but think that it was really odd that I had just felt the baby kick for the first time ever, and it had ignited lightning. I was pretty sure that I must have only been imagining it. It had to have been nothing but an odd coincidence. We may have lived in a paranormal realm, but I had never heard of kicking babies triggering lightning and thunderstorms. My unborn baby was going to be a werewolf, not a magician. But the nagging thought at the back of my mind wouldn't stop reminding me that we had checked the weather forecast earlier that day, and there hadn't been any storms coming. As I had nearly reached the end of the aisle, the door to the cathedral opened, and a short man who I didn't even recognize shouted, "The veil has been lifted." Fuck. I knew exactly what that meant. We were under attack. And I already knew exactly who was attacking us. Milos sent, Chapter 2. As I heard the sound of shots being fired off in the distance, I stood there, completely frozen in place in front of all of my guests. Our guests. My fears of Milos finding us and lifting the veil had come true. Deep down I had known that he would find me one day, but I hadn't expected that it would fall on my wedding day. I hadn't thought that he would try to ruin this day like he had ruined so many other days. It almost seemed intentional, but I knew there was no way that it could have been. Milos had no idea that we were getting married today. We hadn't let anyone off of Nocturne Island know that the royal wedding was taking place today. We would send photos to Wolflandia, the mainland where the majority of werewolves in this realm lived, after it was over. But we had decided to keep the news under wraps. Unless someone from Nocturne Island had allowed the news to leak out. Even though Milos had been able to get inside my mind, Gloria had done a spell that prevented him from seeing everything. Was it possible that the spell hadn't actually worked and Milos had been watching my every move? There was another flash of lightning. Now I knew that the thunder and lightning had nothing to do with the baby I was carrying. No, it was Milos, using his dark magic to make his presence known. Talk about a grand entrance. As it thundered again, shivers began to make their way through me. And to top it all off, I couldn't get my feet to carry me the rest of the way towards my future husband. That wasn't good. As their future queen, I knew that most of our guests' eyes had to have been on me as they looked from my direction. Truthfully, I wasn't even sure what that meant for this situation. Milos finding us meant that the wedding was cancelled, didn't it? I couldn't imagine us spending our time doing this whole wedding thing when we should have been rounding up an army or doing something to stop him. I wasn't even sure what the next steps were supposed to have been. I needed the guys. I needed all of them. I needed Theo, but that was obviously out of the question. I decided to risk losing what composure I did have left. I turned my head, searching for my mates in the sea of guests. I only found one. Reese stood with his arms crossed against one wall between the windows. He nodded in my direction and shot me a tight smile. He didn't look happy, but I couldn't tell if it was because I wasn't marrying him or if it was because Milos was here. Scanning the crowd, I glanced around for the other Darkin guys, but I didn't see them. Where the hell were my other mates? I turned my head back towards the altar and locked eyes with my fiancé then. Concern filled his green irises as he stared back at me. He took a few steps toward me and held out his arm. I hooked my hand through it and allowed him to lead me to the altar, even though it was beginning to feel like the room around us was closing in on me. I could feel myself starting to hyperventilate. I was afraid I was going to have a panic attack right there in front of everyone. The last thing I wanted was for my future kingdom to think that I wasn't fit to be queen, but honestly, even I wasn't entirely sure that I was fit to be queen. The show must go on, right? Kane whispered to me. There was an encouraging look in his eyes. To say that he seemed cool, calm, and collected would have been an understatement. Even though it felt like the world around us was in total shambles, he was still ready to proceed with this thing we needed to do. The look on his face told me there was no turning back now. Maybe I really had chosen the right mate to be king. We stood beneath the wooden arch that had been draped with sheer white fabric and featured dark pink garden roses and light pink peonies and waited for Professor Mindy Lee to begin speaking. Werewolves had to be married by a witch, because there was a magical blessing portion of the ceremony to bind our souls together. Milos's face flashed into my head then, and I knew why. He was here and he was angry that I was marrying someone who wasn't him. Fear filled my gut. My fight or flight instincts were in full swing and all I wanted to do was run away. I would have if it weren't for the fact that I was at my own wedding. Kane, Milos is here, I whispered to my mate. As more shots rang out in the distance, Kane turned to Professor Lee. Maybe it would be best if you skipped to the important part, Mindy. So much for all that time Maddie had spent bothering me about picking out the perfect vows. If only we had known at the time that we wouldn't have a use for them. Right, Mindy said with a nod. Raven Gallagher, do you accept Kane Romero as your husband and your king, for all of eternity or until death do you part? Another knot twisted into my stomach, joining the rest of them. Eternity was a really long time to promise to anyone, let alone to promise to one of your mates in front of the rest of your mates. I do, I said quietly. Kane Romero, do you accept the role as husband and king? Do you swear to protect Raven Gallagher and reign by her side for all of eternity or until death do you part? I do, Kane said confidently. With the magic within me, I bind your souls together, Mindy said as she lifted her palms towards us. Ribbons of neon blue light emanated from them, twisting around us and between us. Look so pretty. I gasped as pain shot through me. It started in my chest before making its way down to my wrist. I knew immediately that it meant my tattoo had changed again. I held my wrist up to glance at it. The darkened paw print now had cracks through it, giving it a shattered-looking effect. At the very bottom of the paw print was a tiny black heart. My heart started to pound as I glanced up into Kane's sparkling green eyes. What if we had been wrong? What if this marriage wasn't just for show? What if it wasn't just the darkened tattoo that was shattered? What if our wedding had changed everything between me and Reese, Aiden, and Colton? Were we shattered just like my tattoo for all of eternity? Chapter 3. We hadn't even kissed. All wedding ceremonies ended with a kiss, and yet ours had completely skipped. That part I realized as Professor Lee stood off to the side so that our photographer could get a few photos of us. I had always imagined my wedding to include a kiss at the end of our vows. It was tradition. I knew these photos would end up in paranormal history books. They would appear in all of the paranormal tabloids. And I didn't even bother to fake a smile for the camera. I was too shaken by everything that was happening, by the fact that I hadn't even kissed my husband, my mate, my king, and by the fact that there were still occasional gunshots being fired. They seemed to be getting further and further apart, which made me think that maybe Milos was running out of ammunition. At least I hoped he was. As our photographer directed us to stand in one final pose, Kane whispered, "You need to make a speech." What kind of speech? Maddie hadn't mentioned any post-vow speeches. I whispered back. Probably because Maddie didn't know that there was going to be a war on Nocturne Island during them, Kane said. Oh, that kind of speech. The kind that a queen was supposed to make. Except I wasn't a queen yet. Not officially. Our coronation was supposed to happen the following week. Right now we were just sort of in limbo. But I suppose that all of this was on me, considering it wasn't like we had anyone else ruling the werewolf kingdom. That meant there was no one for me to take advice from either. I was going to have to make my first speech without any guidance from anyone. What if I did it the wrong way? What if one unprepared speech was enough to make the wolves hate me? What if, after this, they didn't want me to be there? Queen. I glanced over at Kane. What do I say? Shaking his head at me in annoyance, he turned his attention towards our guests, leaving me staring at the side of his head, wondering why he was being like this. "Thank you everyone for being here today," Kane said, his voice booming throughout the room. "In light of the events currently going on outside of these walls, we have decided to postpone our reception." I hadn't expected that he would have been so good at speaking in front of a bunch of wolves he didn't know. "As your future queen and future king, we need your help. We are beginning a full search of Nocturne Island to find and eliminate our attackers," Kane went on. "Most importantly, we want to locate Milos Santorini. We will be outside, waiting in the courtyard for you to join us in our search." Kane grabbed my hand and started to lead me back down the aisle. The wolves in attendance stood for us, but I couldn't help but notice that no one clapped. There was always applause at the end of every wedding ceremony video that Maddie had made me watch while she planned mine. I had this gut feeling that these wolves didn't like us. As we reached the courtyard, we found Aiden, Colton, and Reese were already standing there waiting for us. All three of my matches were even more gorgeous than they normally did, if that was even possible. With their suits and ties, they all looked like they had just stepped out of a GQ magazine. My mates looked so different from one another. It was like night and day. Between the three of them, Reese was the shortest of the three, and his auburn hair was slightly shorter than he normally kept it. There were no barbershops on the island, so my mates had been taking care of their own hair. Colton was the tallest of the three. His blonde hair was on the longer side, and his skin was more sun-kissed than usual because of all the time we'd spent on the beach lately. He looked like he should have been a lifeguard in California or something. And then there was Aiden. His deeply tanned skin and short dark brown hair set him apart from the others. I knew that I had bigger things to worry about than how attractive they were. But even with the gunshots still occasionally being fired in the distance, all I could seem to think about was how drawn I was to the three of them. As we walked towards them, though, I couldn't help but notice that none of them would even look at me. Colton's gray eyes were glued to the ground, and Reese's dark blue eyes were darting around the courtyard. As we approached them, Aiden's honey brown eyes completely avoided my gaze. Instead of looking at me, he glanced over at Kane. I knew that all three of them were hurt because I had married Kane. For all I knew, they might have even been mad at me. And that fucking hurt. It wasn't like I had wanted to choose between the four of them. If it had been up to me, I wouldn't have chosen. But it was what I had to do in order to become queen. Kane had seemed like the most obvious choice because he was a part of the triangle, but that wasn't the only reason I had chosen him. It was his baby I was pregnant with. Not that he knew that yet. None of them knew it. It was a secret that I had been keeping, one that had been easy to hide until now because I hadn't begun to show yet. But I had noticed it this morning when I had put my wedding dress on. the slightest belly bulge. Wasn't a secret I would be able to keep for very much longer, and now that Milos had found a way to get onto the island, I knew that I was going to have to tell Kane. So what's the plan? Aiden asked. We're going to wait for everyone to show up, and then each of us will lead a group in different directions, Kane explained. Yeah. About that, Maddie said breathlessly as she came to stand with us, her mate and husband Brandon Mitchell following after her. I don't think anyone else is coming. What makes you say that? I asked. Well, they all kind of walked in the opposite direction, Maddie told us. Like towards the exit so they could get the hell away from us, Vince said, with a shrug as he and his own mate, Julie, joined us. Everyone? Kane asked. Maddie and Vince nodded. Wow, I said, raising my eyebrows. I can't believe that not even a single person stayed. Really? Kane asked, shooting me another annoyed glance. It makes plenty of sense to me. Their own queen couldn't even ask them to stay. I had to ask them, and they don't even know who I am. Aside from the fact that I'm your husband, I'm completely unimportant to them. I'm not their queen yet, I protested. You practically are. But it's not likely any of them know who I am. Not many of them anyway. They all know who you are, Kane argued. They might not be close with you. Hell, they might not have even held a conversation with you before. But at the end of the day, you are still Princess Fallon whether you like it or not. That means that you have more sway over them than I do. You are royalty. You should have spoken up. I narrowed my eyes at him. You could have told me what to say. Kane shrugged. I shouldn't have to. Yes, you should. Your job as the future king is to support your queen, Colton said, folding his arms across his chest and glaring at Kane. I glanced over at the rest of my mates. Both Aiden and Reese had cold expressions on their faces as they gazed at Kane. I was really relieved that it wasn't me, at least. They thought he was being kind of harsh too. Kane's face twisted into anger. And Raven's job is to always know what to say. I don't think it's your job to know what Raven's job should be, Reese said sharply. I glanced over at him, surprised. Out of all of my mates, Reese had always been the sweetest and the most easygoing. I hadn't ever heard him snap at anyone like that before. Can we all just agree that we need to find Milos before he finds us? Asked. All of this was making my head spin. I was right. This wedding really had changed us. Yes. Now what do we do? Maddie asked. I could tell what she was doing. She was trying to shift the subject so that all of my mates would stop arguing. I don't know. Considering we have no help, I guess we're going to have to search all on our own, Kane replied with a shrug. We should probably separate into groups, Aiden said. Raven, you come with me. Colton and Reese, you guys can go together. Maddie and Brandon, you should both team up with your mates. I'm sorry, but my wife will be teaming up with me. Kane stared at Aiden through narrowed eyes. We don't have time for the two of you to argue right now. We need to keep you separated until you get your attitude under control, Aiden insisted. We need to focus on finding Milos and whoever else Milos brought to Nocturne Island with him. You seem to be forgetting who the alpha of this pack is, Kane snapped. In case you need a reminder, it's not you. Raven will go with me. Actually, I think I want to go search with Aiden. I shot Kane an annoyed glance that should have told him not to question me. Doesn't being the future queen mean more than being alpha? I heard Vince ask. Maddie. The truth was that I was upset about how he had snapped at me over the speech. After the wedding ceremony, I really didn't want to be around him right now. And honestly, it was beginning to make me wonder if I had made the wrong decision. Even though I had thought that Kane would make the best king out of all of my mates, I was beginning to wonder if one of the others could have been a better fit for not just the throne but also a better fit for me. Fine. Whatever. I'm going to go start searching, Kane muttered under his breath. I'll take the north end of the island. Once he was completely out of earshot, Aiden glanced over at me. Raven, are you okay? Yeah. At least I hope to. Chapter 4. After we walked all over the grounds of the castle and our section of Nocturne Island, my wedding dress was completely dirty and tattered at the bottom. Not that it mattered. No one besides my closest friends and my mates were going to see me wearing it again tonight anyway, since we'd had to postpone our reception. Were we ever even going to reschedule it? It wasn't like it had been a real wedding, the kind of wedding that I had always pictured myself having. It was just a sham. A deception so that we would follow the rules so that I could become queen. That was all. Even though I had been able to convince myself as I had walked down the aisle that it meant something, Kane's reaction to me made me realize just how wrong I was. I suppose that, in a way, I had just chosen him because he was one part of the triangle. That meant that along with Iris and Milo Santorini, who were the two other parts of the triangle, he was one of the three most powerful werewolves and alphas in the world. It had made him the most obvious choice for king out of all of my mates. Kane being part of the triangle meant that he had the ability to protect not just me but the rest of my mates too. Not that any of them would have ever agreed that they needed whatever protection Kane could offer to them. But now I was beginning to have regrets. Had I chosen the wrong king? I was pretty sure that I had, but there was nothing I could do about it now. We were already married. The decision was already made. Our souls were already bound. Forever. Our marriage could never just end in divorce like a normal human couple could. The damage was already done. I was just going to have to deal with the fact that I had chosen a king who I was bound to butt heads with. This was all about more than us anyway. This was about all of the werewolves in existence. We had to make sure that this paranormal world war wasn't going to wipe out the entire werewolf population. So what if I had to sacrifice the idea of a happy marriage and the perfect husband? It was all for the greater good. The vampires and witches were already deep into battles against one another. And a lot of the werewolf population was already being killed. And it had all happened because Milos and Iris had started those fires. It was all because they had started this war for reasons I still didn't even understand. I was pretty sure that it was just to torment me. Milos had told me in my mind that there was one way to end the war, and that was to marry him. There was no way in hell I could marry such a monster. I was pretty sure this was all his way of blackmailing me into giving him what he wanted. He could have started a million wars and I still wouldn't have married him. Or maybe I was wrong. Maybe that wasn't even why he had started the war. Maybe it was for the power that came with it, or maybe it was because he and Iris were just downright evil. I could speculate as much as I wanted, but when it came down to it, I would never be sure. The only thing I did know was that it was all about to end soon. As soon as we found them on Nocturne Island, we would get rid of them once and for all. Killing Milos Santorini was something that I had wanted to do for a long time now. I had been waiting years for the right moment for Milos to slip up enough so that I could get to him. For so long I had thought that he'd murdered my parents. Even though I had learned that wasn't true, he had taken someone else who I loved with all of my soul, with all of my being. Theo. Because of Milos, Theo was gone, and he was never coming back. So for that reason I wanted to murder him more than I had ever wanted anything before. Wanted to avenge Theo's death, once and for all. Then, once Milos and Iris were both gone, once I became queen, I would fix the damage they had done. I would declare that the war was over as soon as possible. Since the werewolves were the ones who started it, thanks to Milos and Iris, we also needed to be the ones to end it. There's nothing out here, Aiden said quietly, snapping out of my thoughts. I realized that we had passed the same tree more than once. We haven't even heard any more gunshots. I wonder if maybe Milos left. Aiden shook his head. No, there's no way he left. He's just hiding. He doesn't want us to find him, for whatever reason. What do you think he was shooting at? I asked. Aiden shrugged. I haven't figured that out yet. Maybe it was warning shots. Warning what, though? It doesn't make sense, I pointed out. It almost seems like he was trying to make a big commotion to distract us. It makes sense to me. Milos probably thought all of the commotion would make you postpone the wedding. He pressed his lips together in a flat line. But Kane made sure that didn't happen. Do you think I should have postponed it? I asked as my stomach lurched. I hadn't thought about getting the opinion of the rest of my mates because it was so sudden. I'll be honest. In the beginning I thought that you shouldn't choose Kane. Thought that you should have chosen me, obviously. But that's just because of how I feel about you. I know that I could have given you the wedding you deserved. And I wouldn't have made you skip out on the vows that I would have written for you. But that's only because we were on a time limit. There was a threat and we had to get married fast, I pointed out. He glanced over at me skeptically. Is that really why? Why did he have to marry you so quickly? What difference would it have made if you had cancelled the wedding for even a few days? I considered it. He was the one who ultimately decided we should still get married even though I thought there was a chance that we could get shot. My gut instincts were telling me to run, I admitted. I wish you would have, Aiden said softly. But it's too late now. Now that you're stuck with him, we need to talk about how different he seems, Aiden said, his honey brown eyes sliding over to meet mine. I knew that he wasn't wrong. Kane had always been so kind and caring towards me, even though Theo had always told me he was a monster. I had never seen that side of him. Not until after I had married him, that is. He's moodier, I agreed with a nod. Aiden glanced over at me. Is he moodier, or is he just letting you see his moody side now that you're married? My eyes widened. I didn't want to admit that Aiden could have been right, but it made sense that he could be. He's letting me see his moody side now that he no longer has to impress me. Now that I chose him to become my husband, he knows he's going to become king either way. He doesn't have to keep trying to win me over anymore. Our souls are bound. And more than anything, I really wish that we could unbind. Chapter 5. Later that night, my mates and friends and I all sat around the table in the castle's dining quarters, eating the food that should have been at our reception. Even with my werewolf appetite, neither the grilled salmon nor the multiple shrimp dishes seemed the slightest bit appealing. For the longest time we all sat in silence. I knew that all of us were feeling the same way. We all felt defeated. After searching every inch of the island, we hadn't been able to locate Milos or Iris. In fact, there were no signs they had even been on the island at all. Gloria and the other witches were working on putting the veil back over the island, but I wasn't sure if it would even make a difference. Sort of just seemed like a waste of time. The two werewolves who we had really wanted to keep away more than anyone else were already here, somewhere. I'd had this feeling that the whole time we were searching for them, they had been watching us. I couldn't shake the image of the two of them hiding in a tree or buried beneath the sand right near where we were walking from my head. There were so many ways that they could have hidden themselves from us, and each possibility made shivers creep their way down my spine. They're probably using an invisibility spell, Kane commented from where he sat at the head of the table diagonal to me. I suppose that he would know about invisibility spells better than any of us would. He'd had a lot more practice with them than any of the rest of us have had. The first time I remembered ever being under an invisibility spell myself was back during the ancient times when I was Princess Fallon and he had helped me escape from the castle and more importantly from the king and queen. So how do we make them uninvisible? Maddie asked as she speared a bright red grape tomato, drizzled with balsamic vinaigrette, with her fork. Well, we could see if Gloria can come up with a spell to undo it, Kane explained. Perfect. There has to be a way. A spell. I bet if Gloria doesn't know of any, Professor Lee will probably know a spell we can use. I just know it, Maddie insisted. Kane darted his eyes off to the side and I could tell it was to avoid rolling his eyes at her. I wondered if it was that he found her annoying or pushy, or if he was just irritated that he hadn't thought of the idea first. Either way, his reaction to my best friend had annoyed me. In the meantime, he went on, we can just wait for them to decide to become visible again. That's it? We're just supposed to wait for them to become visible again? That sounds like the worst idea ever. Who knows where they might want to show themselves? Who knows how long it will take? We could be waiting forever. Maddie's idea is so much better. I say we do that one, I said firmly, crossing my arms over my chest. Maddie flashed me a grin. Trust me when I say eventually you get tired of not being seen. I would know. I spent an entire year invisible. Of course he had. When was that? I asked, glancing over at him with raised eyebrows. I was surprised that Kane had never mentioned this before now. We had spent so much time together that I thought I knew everything about him. The fact that he still seemed to have secret parts of his life that I knew nothing about still amazed me. Then again, I suppose that must have been what happened when you had lived literally hundreds of years. There were so many years to cover. A while ago, Kane murmured, his emerald green eyes avoiding my gaze. The way he refused to even look at me made me suspect the absolute worst of him. Why was he being so secretive of it? And a while ago wasn't even a good response. Any time from a few months to hundreds and hundreds of years ago could have been considered a while ago. Ever since we had said, I do, Kane had been revealing that he was a lot sketchier than I had ever thought he was. He reminded me of an onion peeling off each sketchy layer before all that was left of him was nothing that even resembled who he had portrayed himself to be. I knew that when all of the layers came off, there wasn't going to be anything likable about him anymore. And the worst part of that was that our souls were permanently bound together. I was going to be stuck with him for an eternity. And why did you go invisible for a whole year? Aiden questioned. That's a really long time, Reese commented. It must have been incredibly boring, Vince said. I hadn't wanted to ask any further questions myself because I wasn't sure if I even wanted to know what he was doing while he was invisible for a whole year, let alone the reason why he went invisible for that long in the first place. Different reasons, Kane said with a shrug. Different problems. It boiled down to going invisible for a year would help solve them. What type of problems could make you want to run away for an entire year? Aiden narrowed his eyes at him. While invisible, Colton added. I got the sense that they were just as suspicious of this whole thing as I was. A glance around the table told me that almost everyone was leaning in closer, waiting expectantly to find out the answer. Oh, you know. Kane twisted some pasta around his fork. A wife. A wife. I asked, feeling my chest tighten. You never mentioned that you were married before. That was a very important detail that he should have told me about. His soul had been bound to someone else's before it was bound to mine. That was the absolute definition of getting some other girl's leftovers. Why hadn't he thought it was important enough to mention to me? He kept twirling his pasta, completely avoiding my gaze. Then he took a long, slow bite while everyone watched him. He was stalling. He had felt at ease telling my mates and my friends all about his past, but he didn't want to have to talk to me about any of it. Kane swallowed and smirked. You never asked. I didn't think I had to. Well, yeah, I was married. Her name was Miriam. He shrugged. Aren't you still together? Werewolf marriages are permanent, Maddie pointed out. Did you turn my best friend into a sister wife? Vince asked accusingly. He looked annoyed by the idea. Werewolf marriages are for eternity or until death do you part. She died, he informed us with a nonchalant wave of his hand. It's all good. Trust me, one wife at a time is more than enough. He sounded so uncaring about the fact that his wife had died. Oh, so you're a widower then? How tragic, Vince murmured. It was clear that he had noticed Kane's lack of emotion too. So, you went invisible for a year because your wife died? Aiden questioned. No, I went invisible for a year because they wanted to arrest me for her murder, Kane replied simply. That's horrible. You must have been so heartbroken, Vince commented. Why would they think that about you? Kane shrugged. I don't know. Maybe because I did. A pin-dropping silence fell over the room as we stared at him with horrified looks on our faces. Was he serious? He couldn't have been serious. And yet, the way that he had calmly gone back to eating his dinner told me that I had, without a doubt, married a monster. Chapter 6. After we entered the tea room for dessert, my phone pinged with an incoming text message. Glancing down at my phone, I saw that it was from Maddie. Realizing that neither she nor Vince were in the tea room with us, I opened up the text message. Maddie, so, come to my room ASAP. Vince and I need to talk to you. I'll be back soon, I announced. Kane's emerald green eyes locked on mine. Where are you going? I just need to help Maddie with something in her room. I lied. The last thing I wanted was for him to know that my friends had to talk to me in private. I wasn't positive, but I was pretty sure that they wanted to talk to me about him, about what we had just learned. It's our wedding day. Can't it wait, whatever it is? Kane asked. I don't think it will take long. Well, we're almost done here, so why don't you meet me in the king's quarters once you're done? The truth was that I didn't want to be alone with him, not after what I had learned tonight. But instead of arguing about it, I simply nodded, without saying another word. To him, I headed out of the room. I was about halfway down the hallway when I heard someone say, Raven. Glancing over my shoulder, I found Aiden standing behind me. I came to a stop, allowing him to catch up to me. As he approached me, his honey brown eyes locked on mine. Are you okay? Honestly. I took a deep breath. I don't know. I don't think I am. I knew that I didn't need to explain. The reason was because I hadn't realized what I was getting into when I had married Kane. I hadn't known what a monster he was. Of course, that was only if he had really killed Miriam. But who was I kidding? My gut instincts told me that he really had. Why else would he have said it? Aiden didn't ask me to elaborate on why I wasn't okay. He simply wrapped his arms around me in a strong embrace. His body was rock solid, and the truth was that I felt incredibly safe with him. I knew that I would never feel safe like that with Cain again. Sure, he had never hurt me. In fact, he had done the opposite. He had killed Javier, my former professor and bloodmate. Cain had done it to protect me, or so he had claimed. But now I couldn't help but wonder if he secretly just had a secret desire to kill. What if I truly was next? I won't let him hurt you, Raven, Aiden murmured into my ear. I'll make sure that you're safe, always. I knew that he meant every word. I cried against his chest for a few moments, dampening the white shirt he wore under his suit before finally breaking away from him. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for not choosing you or one of the others. That was what I really wanted to say, but I couldn't bring myself to admit that out loud. Admitting it would have meant admitting just how much I had fucked up. Well, everything, my life, my future, all of eternity. No matter how I wanted to look at it, I had chosen the wrong guy. Don't be, Raven. I love you. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure that Cain was still in the tea room, and then he brought his lips down on mine. I kissed him back, wishing that everything was different. I wished that I could turn back time for even just an hour, just long enough to not say I do to the wrong guy. Vince opened the door to Maddie's room immediately when I knocked. When I stepped inside the room, I noticed the grave looks on their faces. It was obvious that they were both extremely worried about me. Are you okay, honey? That dinner was intense. Vince shot a sympathetic look in my direction. I'm not sure what to think, I admitted quietly. Do you think he really killed his wife? Maddie asked me, her chocolate brown eyes wide and full of concern. My gut kept telling me that he had. There was the fact that you wouldn't just drop a bomb like that if it wasn't true. A part of me wanted to believe that he was joking, but he hadn't actually said that it was a joke. He hadn't said that it wasn't true, so therefore I could only assume that it was. But there was something else too. It wouldn't have been the first time he had killed a girl. Aiden had once told me about a girl who Cain had murdered because she hadn't returned his interest. According to Aiden, that was what Cain did whenever he couldn't get his way with other wolves, especially wolves who were girls. The only difference was that his wife had clearly been interested in him, so what was his reason for murdering her? I glanced over at Maddie. I think there's a pretty good chance that he did kill her, I replied with a nod. So, I guess the bigger question is, do you think he would kill you too? Vince asked me quietly. It was the elephant in the room, the question that had been swirling around inside my mind ever since I had found out about Miriam. Up until now, I had only ever thought that Cain had nothing but love for me. But honestly, he was beginning to seem like a serial killer. And if he could murder both of those other girls, then who was to say he wouldn't murder me too? If anything, he had more to gain from murdering me. If he killed me after we became king and queen, then he would still remain the king of the wolves. Without me alive, he would become the sole leader of our kind. That obviously came with a good deal of power, more power than he would have as king to the bloodborne queen, the heiress to the werewolf throne. Without me around, he would have no one to answer to. I didn't want to believe that Cain could have been capable of any of that. But a sinking feeling that all of Cain's past lovers were in a graveyard filled my gut. I don't know, I admitted, answering Vince's question. I'm afraid for you, he admitted. I am too, Maddie chimed in. Me too. There was something else that was plaguing my mind too. If he murdered me, he would also be murdering the baby that I was carrying. Not that he knew that yet. I still needed to tell him about the pregnancy. Maybe if he knew, he wouldn't kill me. At least not until after the baby was born anyway. As far as I knew, Cain didn't have any other children. But that really didn't say much. How much did I really know about him, considering I hadn't even known before tonight that he had been married in the past? Maybe he did have some kids out there who he had never bothered to mention. I'm sure it will be okay, you guys, I said finally, even though I wasn't convinced of it myself. Not entirely, at least. Cain had always seemed to care so much for me. I didn't want to accept that he would do anything to hurt me, but I had one thing in my favor, one thing that I believed would stop him in his tracks: my other 3 mates. I knew that Aiden had meant it when he'd said he would keep me safe. Since Reese and Colton were my mates, that meant they could feel my emotions as if they were their own. If something were to happen between Kane and me, they would be able to feel that something was wrong. They would check on me to make sure that I was okay. And if I had to guess, I was pretty sure that the three of them were already going to be on edge themselves after learning that Kane had killed his wife. It was really lucky that Kane had felt so comfortable around all of us to share that news. My mates and my friends all got to experience it firsthand, versus me telling them about it. It probably caused it to have a bigger impact on them. I knew they were all going to be watching my back. Do you think it's even safe for you to spend the night with him? Maddie asked me. I realized what she was saying. It was our wedding night. We were supposed to spend it together. Would he try to kill me that fast? I don't think he would do anything to hurt me tonight, not after he just admitted to everyone at dinner that he killed his first wife. Sure, Kane might have been crazy, but I didn't think he was stupid. He had to have known that if something happened to me tonight or ever, really all eyes would be on him. And I was pretty sure that if my other mates found out that he killed me, he would be dead so fast it wasn't even funny. Except my other mates couldn't kill him, I realized. According to the prophecy about the triangle, I was the only one in the entire world who was capable of killing him. Was that another reason Kane would have wanted me dead? If he got rid of me, then he would have been completely invincible because no one else could kill him. I guess you have a point about that. He would look guilty as fuck. I just don't trust him with you, Vince said with a sigh. His hazel eyes met mine. Promise us that if anything happens, you'll let us know? I promise. You guys will get an SOS text so fast, you won't even know what hit you. I'm more worried about Kane hitting you. Or worse, Maddie said. But I'm going to sleep with my phone right next to me and one eye open to make sure I don't miss any notifications, Vince quickly added. And we're just down the hallway, Maddie reminded me. If anything happens, all you need to do is scream and we'll be there. Okay, I'll remember that. We should all be really careful right now anyway, I said, glancing over at them. It makes me sort of nervous that both Iris and Milos are on this island somewhere. If Iris is going to hurt anyone, it's going to be one of us. We're the only ones she knows here. We're the only ones that she has any ties to. She'll probably come after me first, but I could see her doing something to hurt one of you guys too. Oh, let her try. Vince shook his head angrily at the idea. I fucking dare her to try to get past my mate. Julie. Maddie let out a snort. She's so sweet. That girl wouldn't hurt a fly. Oh, trust me. You have no idea. You haven't seen Julie when she's pissed off. When she's mad, she's not just a werewolf. She's like a rabid werewolf. She'll tear your fucking head off. If I was Iris, I would be afraid, very afraid. Let's just hope that Iris doesn't try anything, I said with a sigh. Our security guards were still out searching for both of them. So far they apparently hadn't located either of them, or I was sure that we would have heard something. But I just kept hoping that they would turn up at some point. I hesitated for a moment at the doorway. I need to get back to my husband. I still can't believe you're married, Maddie commented. To a murderer, Vince added quietly. Okay, aside from that part. Maddie tapped her chin thoughtfully. Do you think he was kidding? Maybe he was just kidding. I hope that he was kidding. He wasn't kidding. Vince shook his head. Did you see the way he ate his lemon meringue pie afterwards without a care in the world? He looked guilty as fuck. He definitely did it, I agreed with a nod. But maybe he had a good reason for it. A good reason to murder his wife? Maddie looked skeptical. Is there ever a good reason to murder your wife? I don't know. I want to believe that maybe she was some sort of monster. Or more of a monster than he was anyway. A monster that deserved it. But a voice at the back of my mind was telling me I was wrong. Well, why don't you ask him? Vince asked. Tonight. I just stared back at him wide-eyed. I mean, now is as good a time as ever, isn't it? Yeah, ask him while it's still relevant and fresh on both your minds. Maddie agreed with a nod. But it's our wedding night, I insisted. Vince let out a snort. Quickly jabbing him in the ribs, Maddie said. It's true though. Wedding night or not, if you're going to bring it up at all, now is the best time to do it. Part of me didn't want to ruin our wedding night by asking Kane why he'd murdered his wife. What if he did have a valid reason? If he did, then maybe I could relax about all of this and we could move past this. But I knew the real reason I didn't want to ask him, and that was because I didn't actually want to know the truth. I almost felt like the less I knew, the better in a way. If I could postpone knowing why the guy I had chosen to marry, the guy whose baby I was also carrying, had murdered his last wife, the better off it would be for everyone. There was one thought that just kept running through my mind, one that I couldn't seem to bury, no matter how badly I didn't want to think about it. If Cain was as big of a monster as I thought he might have been, did that mean our baby was going to be a monster too? Even though I had always planned to tell Cain about the baby before anyone else, I suddenly had second thoughts about that. What if he found out and wasn't happy about the pregnancy? What if it made him want to kill us too? Knew that was an extreme reaction, considering Cain had only ever made it seem like he wanted to spend the rest of his life with me. But it seemed like a good idea to let my friends know just in case. At least then if I ended up dead immediately after telling Cain that I was pregnant, they would know why. You guys, there's something I need to tell you, I told my friends then. But you have to keep it a secret for now. I don't want all of my mates to know just yet. Can you do that for me? Of course, Maddie replied with a nod. Yeah, you know you can always trust us with anything, Vince added with a nod. I could tell from the looks on their faces that they were worried that whatever I was going to say next was going to be on par with Cain murdering his wife. I realized that they thought that he was an even bigger monster than I thought he was. I swallowed hard. I'm pregnant. With whose baby? Maddie's dark eyes grew really wide. Cain's, I replied quietly. That's the reason I chose to marry him instead of the others. Well, part of the reason anyway. It was a huge deciding factor. Wow, that makes so much sense now. Vince stared back at me sadly. He's the last one that I would have thought you would choose. Maddie nodded her agreement. How far along are you? So, officially, I don't know. Gloria told me that with ancients there's no way of actually knowing with werewolf pregnancies, I explained. It's not the same as a traditional werewolf or human pregnancy. A lot of fate is involved. And you can stay pregnant for up to 3 years. 3 years. Vince's jaw dropped. Ancient werewolves are closer to elephants when it comes to pregnancy. Elephants are only pregnant for almost 2 years, not 3, Maddie said. Why do ancient pregnancies take so much longer? Because we have a lot more magical abilities, and it takes longer for them to develop. Or it can take longer, that is. We can give birth as early as 6 months. That's why Gloria thinks it could happen any day now. So, technically, doesn't all of this mean that any of your mates could have gotten you pregnant? Maddie asked casually. I knew that she was probably hoping that it wasn't Cain's. I couldn't even say that I blamed her. If I could travel back in time and undo everything, well, I really wish that was possible. Well, we can rule out it being Reese's, I replied. I didn't do it with him until August, which was after I already knew I was pregnant. But I had sex with Cain in April for the first time, and that was the last time I had a period. So, I'm pretty sure I'm about 6 months pregnant. I paused for a moment and then turned. I'm just starting to show right now if you look closely enough, and I felt the baby kick during the ceremony. I knew that it probably sounded crazy, but I couldn't help but wonder if it was some sort of warning now. Had my baby been trying to tell me that I shouldn't marry Cain? I couldn't help but feel like it was some sort of sign. Now that I knew about this deep dark secret from Cain's past. Well, congrats, Vince offered. Yeah, congratulations, Maddie said quietly. I'm so excited to be an aunt. And me an uncle, he agreed with a nod. But the looks on their faces told me that they were anything but excited for me. Their responses were forced. I knew it wasn't that they weren't excited that I was about to become a mom. It was just that they were nervous and probably a little fearful about who had fathered my unborn child. So you haven't told the rest of your mates yet? Vince asked. I shook my head. No. And I'm not sure how they're going to take it, to be honest, especially now that we know he killed Miriam. Though the truth was, what their reactions would be like was the least of my worries. I wasn't even sure how my now husband would take the news about our child. Cain doesn't even know. I guess I'm going to tell him tonight. I paused for a moment before adding, after we, consummate the marriage. You're going to sleep with a murderer? Maddie's dark eyes widened. I've already slept with him. Does it even make a difference now? I've already slept with a murderer. Yes, Vince said with a vigorous nod of his head. It does make a difference. Now that we all know the truth. I swallowed hard for a moment before adding, besides, we're already married. Murder or not, we just permanently bound our souls together and agreed to be together for all of eternity. Well, there is one way out of that, Vince said quietly. There is. I hadn't had a chance to talk to Professor Lee or Gloria yet to find out if there was some sort of way to reverse our marriage bond. But as far as I had known, there was no way out of it. Yeah. Vince nodded, a serious look on his face. We could always. Chapter 7. I headed towards the king's quarters, which Kane had already been living in for over a month now. He moved in the day I had asked him to marry me, to be my king, and had stayed there while we were waiting for the wedding to approach. Traditionally, the king and queen maintained separate bedroom quarters in paranormal society. I had been okay with that because it meant that I could spend our off nights together with my other mates either in the queen's quarters or in their own rooms. As I walked to Kane's room that night, it wasn't the same. Normally I walked to his room with a little pep in my step and butterflies swarming around inside my stomach. But this time, with every step I took in his direction, it felt different. This time I couldn't help but feel sick to my stomach. So many thoughts were swarming around inside my head, but there was one thought that kept rising to the surface, no matter how hard I tried to push it to the back of my mind, and it was the scariest thought of all. My best friends actually wanted to murder my husband, my mate, to prevent him from murdering me. The thought made my heart ache a little because at the end of the day, he was still my mate. I did love him. But the worst part about it all was that it may have been the best possible solution depending on the reason he had murdered Miriam. It was a solution that I actually might have liked even though I wanted no part in it. I knew that it was all just hypothetical at this point. Who knew if it would ever actually lead to any of that? But if it did, it made me sad to think that my son or daughter would grow up without a father. Then again, maybe my son or daughter would be better off without Kane. Did I really want him or her to grow up with a serial killer of a father? The last thing I wanted was for my baby to grow up to be a monster too. Besides, I knew there were other strong male figures in my life who would be there for my child and for me. I was thinking of the rest of the Darkin and Vince. They would be there for both of us whether we murdered Kane or not. Correction. Whether my friends murdered Kane or not. Even though I knew that seemed like a realistic solution, there was no way I could help them. They couldn't just ask a girl to murder her own mate. Truthfully, the idea of living with him at all sounded horrible. I knew that losing him would hurt. In fact, I knew exactly how much it would hurt. It would feel the same way losing Theo had felt. But deep down I knew that it was something that might have needed to happen depending on the reason Kane had killed Miriam, that is. If he had a good reason to murder her, then I knew we could forget all of this. Deep down I had a feeling that he hadn't had a good reason. If he had really killed the girl who Aiden had told me about and Miriam, it meant that this was a pattern for him. If he had killed 2 girls, he had probably killed more, which meant 2 things. 1, he was probably a serial killer. I was not only mated to and had married a serial killer, but I had chosen a serial killer to become king. And 2, he was probably going to try to kill me next. I wasn't sure how I had ended up in this mess, but I couldn't help but want to blame Milos for all of it. Milos had killed Theo, and it felt like everything in my life had gone completely downhill ever since Theo had been gone. If it weren't for Milos killing Theo, there was a good chance I might have never married Kane at all. Even though that thought kept entering my mind, I knew that I couldn't dwell on it. I knew all too well by now that you couldn't change the past. Then again, I was pretty convinced that you couldn't change the future either. I had already seen way too many prophecies come true in this world to believe that making different choices could really alter the outcome of what would happen next. I was a firm believer in fate and destiny. When I reached the king's quarters, the door was unlocked. I didn't even bother to knock. As I entered the room, I found Kane laying in his bed. His back was turned to me and he was watching Paranormal House Hunters, a reality show where mediums helped paranormal beings find houses that weren't haunted. Ahem. I cleared my throat from behind him. Kane glanced over his shoulder and then a smile tugged at his lips. Hey my queen, have you come to consummate our marriage? I swallowed hard. We had talked about what our wedding night would be like for weeks now. He had promised that it would result in the most intense lovemaking session of my entire life. But after tonight's turn of events, the truth was that was the absolute last thing I wanted to do with him right now. At least, not until I found out the truth. Actually, I was thinking we could talk first. Oh goody. Kane flicked off the TV and then turned to me, giving me his undivided attention. I stood there for a few long moments, unsure of what to say first. Are you going to come sit next to me? He patted the bed next to him. I hesitated. I wasn't sure how close I really should have gotten to him. Even though he had killed his last wife, he had always been incredibly sweet to me. He hadn't done anything to hurt me in the past, but how could I really be so sure? Reluctantly, I took a few steps closer to him and sat down at the very edge of the bed, maintaining a safe distance. So, what is it you wanted to talk to me about? Kane asked me, his green eyes locking on mine. They were the same green eyes that had stared into mine as he had made love to me. The same green eyes that had told me he loved me so many times before. And they were the same green eyes that my baby had a chance of getting. And yet, I felt like I no longer knew them. They belonged to a stranger. I need to know the reason why you killed Miriam, I said finally. Raven, I really don't want to do this right now. Kane shook his head. Narrowing my eyes at him, I asked, why? Are you afraid that I won't be able to handle the truth? No. I just don't want to ruin our wedding night, he explained. It's supposed to be a good night. We shouldn't be talking about my past at all. You're the one who brought up how you killed your first wife. You practically bragged about it in front of everyone. I paused for a moment. Wait, she was your first wife, right? Or were there others? He stared at me evenly. She was my first and only wife before you. He sighed. You're really going to make us have this conversation tonight, aren't you? Yup. I nodded. Because right now you feel like a complete stranger to me. I've never lied to you, Raven. Everything I've ever told you about me is the truth. There was a genuine look behind Kane's eyes. Yet, you somehow managed to omit the fact that you murdered your first wife. Until tonight, I pointed out. It's not the easiest thing to bring up, he said quietly. So, you did it in a room full of my closest friends in our pack. That makes perfect sense. The sarcasm was just dripping from my voice. What can I say? Liquid courage came over me. Plus, you were all questioning why I went invisible for an entire year. It kind of just popped out of my mouth before I really thought about what I was saying. You mean before you could come up with a lie to cover up what had really happened? I couldn't help but think that was what he really meant. I wondered if he ever would have even told me if he hadn't gotten drunk or the whole conversation about invisibility hadn't come up. I suppressed an eye roll. Anyway, let's just cut straight to the chase. Why did you kill your wife? Because, Kane said, meeting my eyes sharply, she killed my mother. What? Why would she do that? I choked out. I had been so certain, so convinced that he hadn't had a good reason, that killing girls was just what he was. But there he was, handing me what may have actually been a valid reason to kill someone. My mother never liked Miriam. From the very first time they ever met, my mother thought she was troubled. He paused for a moment, his mind seeming to drift back to the memories. At one point, my mother even tried to convince me to end the marriage. She wrote me a letter pleading with me to break it off with Miriam. She didn't think it was a good idea for me to stay with her, given how toxic she was. She wanted me to find someone that would be better for me. She also expressed in the letter that she wanted me to find my mate. Miriam and I had gotten married, but it had always been a dream of mine to find you. His green eyes flicked over to meet mine. I probably shouldn't have been getting butterflies in the middle of the story about why my husband had killed his last wife, but there I was, feeling them swirling around inside my stomach. I had never been a mama's boy, or whatever you want to call it, but the truth is that she actually did convince me to leave Miriam at one point. I told her that we should separate from one another so we could both figure out if this marriage was what we even wanted or not. I thought werewolf marriages cannot be undone, I pointed out. A marriage bond doesn't permanently bond your souls together when you're not marrying your mate, he explained to me. You can part ways at any given time. It's pretty much the same as a human marriage. Oh. He paused. Well, Miriam ended up finding the letter my mother had written me, and she just became full of so much anger and so much rage. She said that my mother was our enemy and that she wished my mother would just die. When I went over to my mom's house a few days later to visit, I found her dead body, and I just knew that Miriam was the one who had done it. His green eyes met mine. I went into my own rage, I guess. I killed Miriam to avenge my mom's death. She deserved it. But I also did it because I didn't want to risk her hurting anyone else ever again. Trust me, I get it. I knew firsthand what it was like to want to avenge a parent's murder. Now, I suddenly felt bad for thinking the worst of Cain, for thinking that killing him may have been my only option. Now that I knew the truth, I felt like we had more in common than I ever knew about. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry you went through that, and I'm sorry that I felt suspicious of your intentions. It's okay, Raven. If you were the one who mentioned killing a former husband that I didn't even know about, I'm sure I would have had the same reaction. I just feel like I'm a shitty wife, and we've only been married for one day. Cain leaned in closer to me and grabbed my hand. You have nothing to apologize for. You are the furthest thing from shitty. It's me who should be apologizing. I'm sorry I snapped at you earlier about you not giving a speech. I guess I don't respond to high-stress situations as well as I thought I did. It's okay. I suppose that neither of us had been prepared for Milos to crash our wedding day. It was new territory for both of us. But we need to learn to start communicating with each other better, and not just for ourselves either. What do you mean? His eyebrows shot up questioningly. There's something I need to tell you. I'm all ears. He leaned in closer to me, his green eyes not moving away from mine. I took a deep breath. I wasn't sure why it was so hard to tell him this, even after learning the truth about why he had killed Miriam. There was nothing that should have made me doubt him anymore. And yet it took several long awkward moments before I could force the words out of my mouth. I'm pregnant. His green eyes widened. With our baby? I nodded. Yes. How do you know for sure that it's ours? He studied my face. I knew that it was a valid question. He knew that he wasn't my only mate who I had slept with. Still, I hated that it even needed to be a question. I hated that his first reaction was to imply that it wasn't his. Why couldn't he have just taken my word for it? You're the last one who I had sex with before I found out I was pregnant. I explained quietly. I just know. How long have you known? Cain asked me. Since July, I admitted quietly. I realized then that I hadn't gotten a period since before we did it in April. You found you were pregnant in July? It's September already. His green eyes met mine, and I couldn't help but think that he looked upset, or maybe even angry, that I hadn't told him before now. You waited this long to tell me. I'm sorry. I just needed time to process it on my own first, I explained. This wasn't exactly how I saw my life going. Well, technically that wasn't true. It was exactly how I had seen my life going, literally. My mind flashed back to the vision that Gloria had shared with me, a vision that I was able to replay through my mind like a movie scene. I was sitting on a throne at the royal palace on Nocturne Island. I was wearing a gold crown which was adorned in sparkling sapphire and ruby gemstones. The part that stood out to me the most was the bump. I was pregnant. My skin was glowing with radiance, and I looked so incredibly happy. I was pretty sure that it was the happiest I had ever seen myself. It is with great pride that I announce to you that the war has ended. While we mourn the deaths of the ones we have lost, we are relieved that more lives weren't taken from us. I promise you that during my reign we will never see a war as ugly as the one we are now free of. At that moment I watched as my mate walked across the stage. He too wore a crown, and people in the audience rose to him. That was when I knew he was more than just my mate. He was my husband, my king. In that vision I had seen that it would be him, that Cain was the one who I would end up choosing as king. After I had seen that vision, I had planned to change the outcome of the vision. I had planned to change the future as a whole. I was determined to choose Theo, not just because of Gloria's vision, but because he was the one who my heart was pulling me to the most. He was the one who felt right. Well, it became clear that you couldn't just change the course of the future like that. Prophecies were real. There was no changing their outcomes. Sometimes I wonder if the entire reason Milos had murdered Theo just moments before I had planned to tell him that I was going to choose him was because my choosing him would have changed the way the future was supposed to play out. I didn't want to believe that Theo was meant to die because I knew that he wasn't. Milos had taken his life from him prematurely. But it was if it was going to happen no matter what, which was why Gloria's vision had involved me choosing Cain. After Theo had been killed, I felt like I had just given in to her vision. Had accepted that this was who I was meant to be with. It may have sounded Crazy, but I sometimes wondered if I would have chosen one of my other mates. If I hadn't seen that vision. Even if I hadn't been pregnant, I was pretty sure that Kane was still the one who I would have ended up marrying. If I hadn't known the plan that destiny seemed to have laid out for me, would I have made a different choice? I would never know because I had seen it. So, I had chosen the mate who I had thought I would end the war with. The good news? The war would end before this baby was born. The bad news? A lot more lives were going to be lost before then. There would be a lot of destruction, a lot of tragedy, and a lot of heartbreak that would happen before the baby came into this world. I could feel it deep in my gut. Our lives were about to change even more than they already